Welcome to ParaTruth. What's going on, ParaTruthers? Welcome to another episode of ParaTruth Reborn. This is a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. We're going to be running a archive of ParaTruth Radio. I hope you guys enjoy it. We've got an actual guest on this week. We're super excited about this because it's actually something Erik and I have talked about extensively, and now we've gotten a guest who's done a lot of research on this as well. His name's Joseph Selbie. Joseph enjoys making the complex and obscure simple and clear. He is the author of Breakthrough the Limits of the Brain, How Neuroscience Supports Spiritual Experience, The Physics of God, A Unification of Science and Religion, and the Yugas, a factual look at India's tradition of cyclical history. He is known for creating bridges of understanding between the modern evidence-based discoveries of science and the timeless experience-based discoveries of the mystics. A dedicated Kriya yoga meditator for nearly 50 years, he has taught yoga meditation and universal experiential spirituality, that was very hard to say, throughout the U.S. and Europe. In 1975, Joseph became a founding member of Ananda, a spiritual movement inspired by the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, author of Autobiography of a Yogi. We are going to be talking about his book, The Physics of God, today. And we're just going to go straight to the line with Joseph Selbie. Joseph Selbie, welcome to ParaTruth Radio.
Thanks for having me.
So we've got you on to talk about the book, The Physics of God, and it was a very intriguing read. But first, like we asked all of our guests, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, a host of things, but in broad strokes, I was very much a science-oriented person growing up. I had a science-oriented family and went to college thoroughly expecting that I was going to come out of it with a science degree. I was interested in microbiology. And then about midway through college, I had a profound hallucinogenic experience. It wasn't my only hallucinogenic experience, but it was particularly meaningful. I felt myself to be essentially transformed into a better person, that I had greater awareness of others. I had a clearer mind. I was intuitive. I was really happy. It was a wonderful experience. And I really liked that person a lot. But there was really nothing in science that I knew at that time that gave me any answers to how I could have had that experience. So I had already been dabbling in meditation, and this just got me in deeper and deeper, not only into meditation, but into the kind of universal spiritual teachings that surrounded it. And that really became my life. I've been meditating for 50 years. I've been living in a spiritual community for over 45 years and have been devoting myself to, those practices and those perspectives on living. But I never left the science part of me behind. I always was fascinated by science, and particularly physics and its kind of picture of the structure of reality. But then I found there were others, including the teachings that I came to, written by Paramahansa Yogananda, that showed how the really deep teachings of science had a great parallel, great congruence with the deep teachings of spirituality. And so for, I don't know, 40 years, I was wanting to write the book. And, much was happening in my life. I had 4 kids. I started a business. And so I didn't get to it and get it published until relatively recently. But it was something that I was deeply interested in. And then it finally, with semi-retirement, came the opportunity to write it.
Okay.
Now, science, we Justin and I have actually talked about this a lot over the last year, especially, is how early on, ancient times and whatnot, science and religion almost seemed to kind of walk hand in hand. You couldn't talk about one without the other. At what point do you think science and religion really went their separate ways, and why do you think people are so adamant on keeping it that way? Because I know you, as you just said, and Justin and I were always saying that religion and science should remarry, because that's when you get the full picture. Because right now I feel like if you're choosing one side or the other, you're not looking at it something wholly,
Well, in the history of science and religion, and I'll just say for discussion purposes that science kind of got its beginnings in the 1700s and then into the 1800s. And for that first 200 years, from 1700 to 1900, scientists described their activities as exploring God's creation, and that it was definitely God's creation, and they were just finding God's laws and God's purpose in that science. And so science and religion were able to, coexist quite easily, because most of those physicists and scientists were themselves religious in some way or another. But around 1900, the tide sort of turned, and it turned, I think, because those scientists who were deeply interested in the fundamental reality that science could show you, to their minds, they couldn't find God in it anywhere. And everything seemed to work in a law-like, lawful way that only involved matter and energy, that every phenomenon that they could study found an answer in matter and energy. And so more and more scientists began to seriously question whether there was God, whether there needed to be God, whether the yet unanswered questions about where did the universe come from, where did life come from, where did intelligence come from, they began to be more and more convinced that those rules of matter and energy would eventually answer all of those. And that, in a way, God just became unnecessary in terms of their view of reality. So then, I don't know, I would say in the 20s, 30s, 40s, there was a deep shift where people who believed that there could be a God began to be looked down on by the scientific community, right? That they not only saw how, for their own understanding, that matter and energy explained everything, and or would eventually explain everything. And anybody who didn't think that was a little, maybe stupid or naive or gullible. And that belief system began to kind of take on a religious meaning all of its own. Science became religion somewhere in the early 20th century. And it still is today, the predominant worldview. If you want to think of religion as a worldview, science is that predominant worldview even today. And it's very difficult for anybody who works as a scientist to be able to conjecture about how consciousness or intelligence or life could have origins beyond matter and energy. They're kind of swatted down in a hurry by those most influential within the world of science and physics. So it kind of flipped from science supporting religion to science not supporting religion at all sometime in the 20th century. But their promise that matter and energy would eventually be able to explain the big three unanswered questions. That's the way I think of them. The big three unanswered questions is, where did the universe come from? Where did consciousness come from? And where did life come from? There are still no answers to those questions that are anything more than conjecture. And so I think their promise that science can explain everything with just matter and energy is getting thinner. And plus, you have a broadening of awareness within Americans, but throughout the world, of other religious philosophies, particularly those coming from India and China, the East in general, that relate to God not as an anthropomorphic God, which is what many Christians and Jews and Muslims think that God is some sort of being, that is a much more powerful but still individual being that created everything and created us. In the East, God is not only not anthropomorphic, but God is an infinite spirit, and we are a part of that spirit. That our nature is God's nature, and God's nature is our nature. And once Americans, Western civilization began to embrace and understand and appreciate this very different way of looking at God, it also started to open up the possibilities for understanding how physics, modern physics, and this more expansive view of God can actually be compatible rather than at loggerheads with each other.
Well, now I'm going to take a step back, because you had mentioned how science has kind of become a religion in a way. And so one thing that really stood out to me at the very beginning of your book is this concept of scientific materialism. Now, for years, Justin and I had argued that science actually is a religion, even if scientists claim otherwise, because, the scientist wants to say, yeah, we have a religion. It goes against their whole purpose. But for our listeners, can you just define what scientific materialism is and how it relates to religion?
Well, scientific materialism is a concept that's been around for a long time, actually. And I think it's somewhat ironic that it is what are known as scientific philosophers who coined the phrase. And the scientific philosophers basically noticed that there was a school of thought within science that says matter and energy are the only realities. And the interactions between matter and energy explain every phenomenon, or will explain every phenomenon. And so this is a defined point of view, a defined philosophy. And you will find, if you read articles by scientists who are scientific materialists, that this underlying assumption is always there, that there really isn't anything other than that. And it's such a accepted assumption among scientists that it has become a belief system. It's a hard and fast belief system that There is nothing more than matter and energy. And it pervades scientific journals, it pervades research. You see it in particular when prominent scientists or even junior scientists have the temerity to suggest that consciousness could be more subtle, that consciousness could exist beyond the brain. I mean, the attack is fierce, and it's very much, and it was literally put in these terms by, and I don't have his name, I wish I did, but he was the senior editor of one of the highest scientific journals in the world, accused a scientist who suggested that consciousness could exist, beyond matter and energy, accused him of being a heretic. Now, that has got to be richly ironic, right?
Mm-hmm.
It suggests heresy in religious terms is that you're preaching outside of the accepted dogmas of that particular religion. So to accuse a scientist who, all scientists are supposed to be neutral observers of the facts who then make their conclusions based on facts and not on anything other than facts. So to shoot down somebody and hard by accusing them of being a heretic to science just indicates how much it is a personal belief and how much it matters to those who really believe in that system, that it would attack others. So it has the trappings of religion. It's got this key central belief that you can't question. It has a sort of high priesthood of people who control the scientific journals. And it has control over funding, which is the lifeblood of scientific research. To the extent where, if you want to be a scientist, you want to have a career as a scientist, you just don't bring up consciousness. You don't bring up God. You don't bring up any possibility of it, or you'll be excommunicated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something that's interesting that you've brought up and you mentioned several times in the book of science basically being matter and energy. Something that I was brought up in Christianity. I still believe some of those core beliefs to an extent, but I have studied, like you're saying, Buddhism and a lot of the Eastern philosophies and religions. But that, to me, right there, explains God in and of itself, matter and energy. If you think of it from a Christian standpoint, Jesus and God. If you think of it as from a Eastern standpoint, God, quote unquote, God in their beliefs are the one and the same as we are. So that, to me, right there, explains that there is a God, however you define it. So I'm not really sure how science could say they don't have proof.
Then no one has proof, you mean?
Right.
Well, they just don't like the idea. I think it's, they're people, right? They're just people. We don't want to elevate all scientists to, the stature of Einsteinian genius. They're just people like we are, who are looking at discoveries and facts and experimentation and drawing their own conclusions and making their own interpretations. But just like people, they have biases. And I think right now there's this huge bias against there being any possibility that there is God, that there is some higher consciousness, higher power, anything beyond just the intellect that we experience as people living today is that the highest level of expression that those scientists can embrace and accept. So coming back to your point, I think a lot of what you can do with scientific discovery is a matter of interpretation. That what I tried to do very carefully in my book, The Physics of God, is I didn't want to bring in any discovery that was controversial. But I wanted to make it clear that those discoveries admitted of reasonable other interpretations than the ones that insisted it means there is only matter and energy. So, well, I started in my second chapter or third chapter, I forget which, by sharing with people the double slit experiment and with the mind-boggling results of some double slit experiences or experiments that indicate matter doesn't behave like matter unless it's observed by an intelligent observer. And this experiment has been around since the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing radically new. It's been done over and over and over again with the same results, which is that if you leave an experiment running on its own, unobserved, but yet you have a way of recording how that experiment is running, you will find that it behaves as if whatever is being observed is behaving like energy, it's behaving like waves. But as soon as it is observed or measured, it starts to behave like matter. Now, I love to walk people all the way through that experiment because the words I just used usually just kind of go right over your head, right? Like, oh, okay, whatever you're saying, dude, but when you actually walk step by step through the experiment, you really have to scratch your head at the end. That how could it be? The only difference in the two ways in which that experiment is set up are that it was measured. And yet, what had behaved like a wave starts to behave like matter. Mm. And this has never been disproved. This has never been disproved. You will read articles by scientists who are scientific materialists who kind of brush it aside. And they brush it aside with the attitude that this is just some strange artifact of the experimental process. And one day we will understand why it appears to be that we need an intelligent observer to make matter behave like matter. But in fact, nothing has ever been discovered. 100 years later, they are still refining this experiment. So that's just one example of an experiment that has concrete evidence, but can be interpreted in different ways. Now, I choose, as many before me have chosen, to see that there's a role of consciousness. That consciousness exists as yet unmeasured reality that influences the way matter and energy behave. And that is a direction that science could take, is to keep exploring what that material could be, what that reality could be. But they don't, because it doesn't fit the belief system that the only thing that exists is matter and energy. Mm-hmm. So they just don't go there, as the old saying is, right? That they just leave it be. But it keeps rearing its head. It's interesting to me to see how often and how many generations of scientists have had this discussion of what does it actually mean. Mm-hmm. And then they trot out all the old arguments about what it could be and what it couldn't be. And then they're just left agreeing to disagree. There are at least a dozen interpretations of what quantum physics indicates the nature of reality is, right? Quantum physics has been around, from that time, 1920s, 1930s, when it really began making all these discoveries of what has been lumped together subsequently as quantum weirdness, like things like entanglement and the observer paradox. And so this debate comes up over and over, and it has split into these dozen or more interpretations of what all that quantum weirdness actually tells us about reality. And about 2/3 of them are scientific materialist, but 1/3 of them aren't. And 1/3 of those interpretations are backed by, heavy-hitting physicists who were central to the development of quantum physics. So the jury is by no means, been given the evidence and arrived at a final decision, final verdict. And there are other things. There are many scientific experiments done in universities that indicate consciousness exists outside the brain and exists in some unmeasurable form that are really good experiments. They're not, most of the time, these kind of experiments are dismissed by the mainstream scientists as indicating sloppy science or obvious bias led to these discoveries, and we're just going to ignore them. There's one in particular that I like to share that just can't be denied. So the experiment was done in various ways by various teams, with various professors leading those teams across several universities, where two subjects would agree in some way or another to interact with each other. In the very first one, they meditated together. In others, they just agreed to do the experiment together. But in the very first one, they meditated together, and then they were separated, and they were put into Faraday cages. So Faraday cages are basically copper wire mesh around a person or a space that interferes with any kind of electromagnetic transfer. So if you had a radio on searching for stations while you're inside a Faraday cage, you're not going to get any signal. It just blocks out any electromagnetic signals. So then, once they're in the Faraday cages, completely separate from each other, they can't see each other, they can't hear each other, they have no idea what is happening to each other. There was no explanation given them, other than they agreed that they would participate in this experiment. And one was taken into his cage and hooked up to essentially a lie detector, an EKG machine. And the other person was hooked up to the exact same type and kind of EKG. And then subject A was shocked by bright flashes of light. And when that happened, his EKG spiked, and then, lesser spikes, and then settled down, right? And he was subjected to this randomly for, I think, like 30 minutes. So he didn't know when the flash was coming, didn't know how bright it was going to be, but every time it happened, his EKG registered. Now, all of this completely expected, right? Been done in experimental ways for decades and decades. But never done before was to measure the other guy. And I think in the original experiment, it was two. The other guy just sat there, didn't know what was going on, just sat there. But every time subject A, subject 1, had a bright flash in his eyes and his EKG jumped, so did subject 2's. Now, he didn't have a light flashing in his eyes. He didn't have any external reaction that was measurable, but his brain waves responded at the same time and in a similar fashion to the way this other guy did. Now, they did control groups where they hadn't meditated together, they hadn't agreed to be in any way connected, and there was no correlation. The subjects that agreed to do the experiment and stay connected, however loosely they wanted to interpret that, right? And they weren't told what exactly they were looking for or anything. They just agreed, okay, I'll stay connected. Then they had this. So how is that explainable with matter and energy alone? It suggests that there is something more subtle, that there is some way in which our brains receive information from outside of our physical brain.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other experiments like this, but they don't get any of the attention or validation that they deserve by mainstream science, because mainstream science just doesn't want to go there. It's easier just to dismiss these as, there's sort of this, what would you call it? Prideful response to it.
Mm-hmm.
That, if we were there, if real scientists were there conducting this, we know we'd see the flaw in the scientific method. We'd understand why this appeared to have a correlation when no correlation was there. So it's just utter disregard and dismissing it, because their whole life view would have to be turned on its head for them to come in and say, oh, there's something here.
Mm-hmm.
But there's enough scientists out there now who've been doing these kind of experiments. And I would recommend to your listeners to go to the IONS website, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, and look for Dean Radin's favorite experiments. And he has a group of, hundreds of experiments, all of which he feels rise to the level of well done, well conducted experimental science. And yet they all, in one way or another, indicate that there is a mental quotient, there is a consciousness quotient, there is a something that is going beyond matter and energy that is causing the results of these experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So those all exist, and you really don't have to look far to find them and read about them. But even the main key findings of science suggest there's got to be more than matter and energy to explain the behaviors that we have. Where did the universe come from? There's nothing. I mean, the universe is matter and energy.
It's all speculation.
Where did the matter and energy come from? And they'll say, well, it was a quantum fluctuation. Well, a quantum fluctuation in what?
Right. Well, and then
there's got to be something in which it could fluctuate. Where did that come from?
And then they're trying to study it. That's from so many years.
You can kick the can down the road as far as you want, but they still have not answered that basic question.
Mm.
Well, I think one thing that that I noticed, especially in terms of your story about the cage, or the two guys in the cage, is what exactly is energy? Because I personally see energy as also being spiritual. It's a different type of energy. And in your book, you do talk about how, for example, there's light all around us, but we can only see within a certain spectrum. And I would imagine it's the same as any energy source. We can't detect all energies. And so what I have kind of noticing is this idea that matter is what separates humanity, because from here, I can't touch you and vice versa. But if I was on this, talking with a certain energy, whether it be, let's say anger, or say I'm upset, anyone on here talking to us or around us would feel that. It's this feeling, this interconnectedness of energy between us. We've actually talked about this on the show in the past, because we've had guests on who talk about, they call them like energy vampires, for example, where you're walking past somebody and you just feel this weightiness, somebody's just hurting, you kind of feel that. And so this idea of energy being, that can make sense to me, that the two people in the cage can actually connect in that way, energy wise, because they allowed themselves to link via energy. When you disconnect yourself, it's nearly impossible.
Right.
Also, going back to regarding scientists and their view on God, do you think it's, you said pride, and I like to think of it as also self-absorption, because I feel like a lot of scientists want to believe that they are humans, the highest that any living being can possibly be. They don't want to put anybody above them, and therefore they just completely deny the existence of God for that reason. But then on top of that, we don't have any scientists, either Christian or otherwise, who are willing to go forward and create, use the scientific method in a way that'll actually give us true results. Because I feel like whether it's a secular scientist, a Christian scientist, or someone else entirely, they're always going to try to manipulate the evidence in their favor. And I see that time and time again when science tries to talk about religion and religion tries to talk about science. And it's kind of disheartening.
Yeah. I mean, they are part of the dominant worldview today. I mean, if you look at science as a religion, then I would say 75% of the people on the planet are in that religion. Mm-hmm. That scientific materialism is deeply and viscerally accepted by people all over the world. And that one of the reasons I wrote the book is that I was trying to reach people who are maybe on the fence, maybe somewhere where they could be persuaded that it's possible that there is a God, and that science, everything that science is saying and everything that science is discovering rather than saying are both valid. So that they don't feel like they have to not believe in God. I think that's, a big barrier for many people. But it is a very strong thought form. It's like it's like a political party that has 95% of the seats in the in the Congress. They can pass any law they want. They are very powerful. There were some inroads made by the intelligent design folks that pointed out some major questions in evolution, Darwinian evolution. And they were just beaten up. they were like attacked for even, sullying Darwin's good name kind of energy, or you don't call my mama that. It was really emotional, immaturely emotional kind of response, because they're just so convinced that they are right. And I think it is human nature that everybody wants to feel like they know what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. And scientists can tell each other that they really know what's going on, and pat each other on the back and reinforce each other's views. I understand it. I like to think I know more than scientists, right? So maybe I'm guilty of the same human tendency, but it is strong and it is self-reinforcing, and you don't attack it lightly.
Right.
back to your comment, though, that you started with, which is a very good and insightful comment, that energy, when I use that term in this definition of scientific materialism of matter and energy, is really the energy that is measurable by current scientific devices.
Mhm.
And yet in physics, particularly in the areas of string theory, that are 1 billion times finer than the finest electromagnetic frequencies. And that those frequencies make up these vibrating rings and strings that are the fundamental substrate of all matter, whether local or non-local. That string theory sees a reality that encompasses what I like to call the cosmos rather than just the universe. Because in string theory, the cosmos can include other universes. There can be multiverses. And so it's a mind-manglingly larger conception of reality than the one most of us are familiar with. But it's predicated on this notion that energy can exist and does exist at super high frequencies, 1 billion times. I mean, we're talking tiny frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I agree with you that what we could be talking about that could explain some of the anomalous things, could explain ghosts, could explain other paranormal phenomena, are because they're realities that are vibrating at much higher frequencies than anything exists to measure them on the earth. But it doesn't mean they can't exist. So, but I would say consciousness is, if it is a frequency, it is the highest frequency. It is perhaps an unmeasurable frequency. There are some spiritual traditions that suggest consciousness is vibrationless, that it is the rock upon which all vibration stands, and that all of creation is, you've probably run into this concept in Eastern teachings, that all of creation is dualistic. So you've got yin and you've got yang, and that all stems from this primal creation of vibration, because vibration is dualistic. Vibration is energies moving in two different directions, if you will, and creating this, what we think of as energy. Energy is just vibration in one form or another. So I completely agree with you. I think there are a lot of things that explain how we function as human beings that have to do with us having another layer or two or three of our reality that vibrates at higher frequencies. And that's why I believe that when we die, we are still perfectly aware. We feel like we have a body. And it may, in many people, when they die, it takes them a while to realize that they're dead, because what they're experiencing is so similar to what they experience while alive that it takes them a while to realize that, well, this body is a little bit different, and it's finer, and there's more light here. And of course, this being just floated into my awareness without walking in. You know, the clues start to pop in that they're not in Kansas anymore. But at the same time, they're very similar. They still have the memories. They still have the same level of intellect and feeling that they had when they were alive. And the only real difference is that they dropped a physical body away that was vibrating at a lower frequency. But that all along, they were animating that body, they were existing within that body, at a higher level of frequency. So the people who aren't happy about dying and who want to stay around for one reason or another are ghosts. They're souls still vibrating at these high frequencies, but for one reason or another, stuck here, caught here, wanting to be here. And they, people who are perceptive, psychics, can see them kind of come into view and out of view. But they're very real. And that though the vast majority of people who die just go on to these other realms, heavens, astral regions, spirit worlds, whatever, and however you want to describe them. The Indians called them the happy hunting grounds. Whatever view you want to take, almost every ancient tradition, every religious tradition suggests that there are realms beyond the physical, and that they are finer and they're better. And a lot of the ills of physical reality don't exist there. There isn't. Bodies don't get sick. You don't get hungry. You don't need to eat food like we do to survive. You don't need to breathe oxygen. There, you have a freedom to move that is nothing like what we have on the earth. So I very much believe that, as I put in, whether I put it in The Physics of God, but I put it in other books, that we always have one foot on earth and one foot in heaven. That we are a matrix of bodies. And the outermost matrix that we can see with our senses is a physical matrix. And then we have other bodies that are undetectable energy as far as what we can detect today with modern scientific instruments that are always there. And in fact, without them, the physical body couldn't exist. It's not as if the physical body is the real one, the important one, and the others are these kind of ephemeral things that happen to be there. The other bodies are really what give substance and power to the physical body. And then when physical body is no longer functioning, we still have those finer matrices of energy in which we exist.
All right, Joseph. Well, it's about that time where we usually let our guests go. So I want to give you the chance to tell everybody where they can find you, find the book. The mic's all yours.
Well, the easiest way to find out more about me and the other books I've written and some of the articles that I've written, other interviews I've been on, is to go to my website, which is at josephselbie.com. Selbie, my last name is spelled somewhat unusually. It's Selbie rather than the more typical Selby. So Joseph Selbie, spelled Selbie.com. You can find all those things. My books are available pretty much everywhere you would expect, with the various online e-tailers and some bookstores.
All right, Joseph Selbie, thank you for being on ParaTruth Radio.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We did just get off the line with Joseph Selbie, the author of The Physics of God, Unifying Physics, Consciousness, M-Theory, Heaven, Neuroscience, and Transcendence. There's a lot of material in this book. And we didn't even cover even a quarter, I think, of this book with our conversation with Joseph. But just based on a lot of what he was sharing with us, I don't know about anyone else listening, but I've already went through this book, and they're just little details, minuscule details that I kind of want to go back and touch up on. Because you know how it is with me when it comes to the science aspect of stuff, things that are written scientifically, big words, for example, or diagrams, I get lost. But this was actually one of the most fascinating books that I've actually gone through, because I think you and I have for so long discussed how science and religion should be remarried, and kind of work together to find the truth. And that's more or less what this book is kind of hinting at. There's significant differences between them, and the fact that science has become a religion in and of itself is very interesting. And it reminds me just again, because I don't think we think about it in modern, like it's happening to us. And it makes me think like back in, let's say, early Christianity, when Christ was on the earth, like people back then might not have been thinking like, oh, this is a new religion. It's starting.
Mhm.
Just like today, science doesn't feel that way, but it is. And we see it time and time again where a new quote unquote world religion takes the reins, becomes big, gets squashed by another new religion, gets big, gets squashed. And right now, I'm not saying that that's happening, but I do see a significant impact with science and Christianity specifically, because I feel like those are the two quote unquote religions that are probably banging heads the most these days.
Right. Well, through his explanation too, I mean, he made a really good point about science is a religion in and of itself, although they will not say it is a religion. And if you think of Scientology as the religion of science, it's not. It's actually completely different than what you would think when you hear the term Scientology. You would think that they're saying that science is a religion and it
Right.
explains everything, but no, it's completely different. And maybe we'll have a former Scientologist on one day to kind of explain it. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that have been Googling Scientology and all that. And your listeners, I'm sure, have probably seen what Scientology really is. But something that he explained in this interview and what he explains in the book, in my opinion, science has proved that there is a God. Whatever you define it at is completely different than what science defines it as. But for them to say that there is no God, but not be able to explain what Joseph was explaining, that they haven't been able to prove where the universe came from, they haven't been able to prove where consciousness has come from. That tells you right there that there is something bigger than science that is not necessarily controlling things, but overseeing things.
Mhm. I mean, I think overseeing is a good word to use there. Um, it makes me think of the whole chicken and the egg thing, because it's like, well, what came first, the energy or the matter?
Right.
Uh, and the one thing about energy, because for a long time, science was saying that more or less energy is depleting, right? The more matter there is, the less energy seems to show itself, and we see that in like dying stars, for example.
Hmm.
Uh, but then only in relatively recent times we start seeing new suns being born, new energy sources being created. Even when you think of like a black hole, that in and of itself is just an energy source that grows larger and larger and larger and creates new energy sources on the, I guess, the backside of it, and it spits out the what they call the white holes, I guess. That's like a loose term used for the opposite side of a black hole, where all that
Right.
star energy or
Yep.
material is spit out. So we constantly see energy being recycled and rebuilt, which then leads to more matter and new galaxies, new planets, new stars. Uh, and it's clockwork, man. It's really interesting. Like, there's, to me, I see some intelligent design in all of it. Like, it doesn't make sense that this is, and that's the big thing with science, modern science, is that everything happened by random chance. The reason you and I are doing this podcast is by complete random chance, from something that happened millions of years ago that just happened to line up perfectly to put us in this position. And just, that doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't register.
Right. Well, even when I was a kid and I had kind of lost my faith, I had searched and searched and searched, but still could not bring to terms that what science is saying happened is what happened.
Yeah. There's this saying, and I'm sure you've heard it, and I'm sure all of our listeners have probably heard it at one point or another. But the saying is there's a God-shaped hole in all of us,
Mhm.
right? And it's just mainly this idea that no matter how much we keep searching and searching and searching, we never actually find what we're looking for until the idea being we accept God. And at which point everything else falls into line. Now, in my own experiences, I found that to be true. And of course, obviously, with anybody's walk, it gets a little rocky, a little
Mhm.
shaky. But still, looking back to 2009 when I was born again, there are moments in my life back then that I feel like I'm missing out on at times. Like I was like, where is that? Like I miss that feeling, the whatever it was. And I know it's here, I know it's there, but there's like moments throughout uh life where you feel closer to that, for me, to God, or closer to whatever it is that fills you, but it's always fleeting to some extent. And again, I think that just has to do with more human conscience and how we tend to humanize everything. Everything's
Mhm.
materialistic nowadays, right? You can never have too much of a good thing, especially if all you have to do is put some green paper down and get the thing you want. You put it in your house. Uh, but yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I think it's really interesting to see how far science and religion has come. And just the simple notion that science is actually a very, very young concept.
Mhm. For sure. And I didn't ask this question because he did kind of explain it a lot when he was talking about science and the experiments that they've been doing. But even CERN with the Large Hadron Collider and discovering the quote unquote God particle.
Mm,
Now, that's not saying that that is God. The God particle is what they're saying all existence has kind of stemmed from. I feel that they are explaining a lot of the truths behind science uh denying that there is a higher power, but at the same time proving it as well. And let's face it, religion is just an explanation of what we can't see or hear or explain. uh Science is kind of that same way, but science is saying that they are proving this, and I feel that they are far from proving many things that we can't explain.
right. Totally agreed. But I do see also where, again, science does kind of, like you said, science kind of proves God's existence. And and I think this is one of the most simple things. And I think it's called the Fibonacci sequence. Uh,
Fibonacci, yep, yep.
Fibonacci. So we've talked about this way back when we did the interview. I forget his name, but he did the book Evolution 2.0. This was brought up,
Oh,
and
I honestly don't even remember him bringing up the
uh,
Fibonacci sequence.
it's this idea. It's a mathematical sequence that's constantly
Mhm,
repeated throughout the known universe, from this uh um tiniest of atoms or whatever
mhm,
on Earth to these galaxies, where it's just this kind of swirl effect, if you will, that just kind of spins on itself. And we see it in plants, we see it in various animals, we see it in seashells and rocks and sand, and we see it in the waves, the way waves curl on the ocean or in the lakes. We see it in multiple galaxies, every galaxy, in our view. It's there. That's an equation that shows, in my opinion, something that isn't just random. Like, it's, to me, that's something that was specifically placed in that sequence for a reason. Because honestly, there's no reason for it. There's no reason. Like, it doesn't. It's not like plants use this mathematical equation to better itself. It just happens to be. why? You know?
Right. Well, and with you bringing that up, that really shows too that science is not necessarily proven religion, but proving of a higher power, because that goes along the same lines of divine geometry too,
Mhm.
where there are these sequences in anything, any type of geometry that there is, to show repetitiveness that would only be given to us by something that is much higher and much more intelligent than we are.
Right.
So, but I think we could probably talk about this till we're blue in the face.
Oh, yes. Sure.
So we leave it up to you, our listeners, what you guys want to believe in and think. But definitely check out the Physics of God. Check out Joseph Selbie's website as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this archive of ParaTruth Radio. This was a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network.